Good morning, everyone. Today is a today I will demonstrate the fourth ventricle. Now we can see the fourth ventricle. So you can see this is the fourth ventricle. Now before I am going to demonstrate the fourth ventricle, firstly we know the orientation of this picture. So you can see this is the ventral aspect and this is the dorsal, and also called the posterior, and this is the anterior. And here you can the superiorly is the cerebral hemisphere, and this is the corpus callosum, and you can see this is the cavity. This cavity is the third cavity of the third ventricle. Here you can see this is the midbrain, and this is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata, and posterior to this here you can see this is the cerebellum. So you can see the cerebellum. So between the pons and the medulla oblongata and to the cerebellum, here you can see this is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is the tent-like cavity. This is the tent-like cavity of the hindbrain. It lined with the ependyma and filled with the CSF. It lies into the posterior cranial fossa in front of the cerebellum. Here you can see this is the cerebellum, and behind the pons and upper part of the medulla oblongata. So you can see this is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle, it has the floor. You can see this is the floor also called the anterior wall, and it has the roof. You can see this is the roof, and it has the lateral wall and the some races extension of the cavity called as the races, and the angle and a sum of the angle, and the sum is the communication with the opening into the fourth ventricle. So firstly we know the angle of the fourth ventricle. So you can see this one. This is the superior angle. The cavity of the superior angle here, it continue upward in the cerebral aqueduct. So you can see this is the aqueduct, and inferiorly then you can see the inferior. You can see this is the inferior angle. The cavity of the fourth ventricle and to the inferior angle, it continue inferiorly the central canal of the spinal cord. It has two lateral angle. We cannot appreciate over here. The lateral angle, one on each side, it carry out across the dorsal surface of the inferior cerebral peduncle, and so this is the uh, angle of the fourth ventricle. Now we can now the recesses of the fourth ventricle. The recesses are the extension of the direction from the cavity of the fourth ventricle into the surrounding structure of the fourth ventricle. There are the two lateral races. You can see these are the two lateral races. One on the east side extend laterally in the interval between the inferior cerebral peduncle ventrally and the peduncle of the flocculus dorsally, and lateral extremity of the races reach up to the flocculus and open into the subarachnoid space of the cerebropontine angle over here on the east side, and as the lateral aperture. Here you can see this is a lateral aperture, that is called a lateral aperture, that is called the foramen lusca onto the east side into the subarachnoid space. Now another races, you can see this is the one medial dorsal races. Here you can see this medial dorsal races extend into the white core of the cerebellum, lie just above to the nodules. Now another recesses, you can see this is the two lateral dorsal races. They are the dorsolateral races on the east side of the medial dorsal races. Here you can see this one. This project dorsally above the inferior medullary velum, immediately lateral to the nodules. So this is the recesses of the fourth ventricle. Now we can appreciate in the specimen of the. Now we can see the fourth ventricle on this specimen. Before I am going to the demonstration of the fourth ventricle, firstly we know the orientation of this specimen. So you can see this is the superior and this is the inferior, this is the ventral aspect, and this is the dorsal aspect. It's also the posterior, and this is also called as the anterior. So this is the superiorly. Here you can see this is the midbrain, and this is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata, and posteriorly here you can see the cerebellum. In front of the cerebellum here, and behind the pons and the upper part of behind the upper part of the medulla oblongata, this is the fourth ventricle. You can see this is the fourth ventricle. It's superiorly it continues the cerebral aqueduct. Here you can see this is the cerebral aqueduct, and inferiorly it continue with the central canal of the spinal cord. The fourth ventricle, it has the floor. You can see this is the floor and the ventral wall, and the roof. You can see this is the roof, and lateral boundary, and some angle and some recesses. Now firstly we can see the angle of the ventricle. So you can see this is the superior angle. Here the superior angle, the cavity of the fourth ventricle into superior angle is continue upward to the cerebral aqueduct of the midbrain. Here you can see, and inferiorly it is the cavity. Here inferiorly you can see the inferior angle. The cavity of the fourth ventricle continue in the central canal of the spinal cord here. Now it has a two lateral angle. We cannot appreciate over here. Now the recesses of the fourth ventricle. The recesses of the fourth ventricle cannot appreciate over here. They are the two lateral recesses, one medial dorsal recesses, and the two lateral dorsal recesses. So this is the fourth ventricle. Here you can see. Now the roof of the fourth ventricle. You can see this is the roof of the fourth ventricle onto the. You can see the onto the posterior aspect. See that. So the roof is of the fourth ventricle is a tent shape. It apex is project posteriorly into the white core of the cerebellum. It has upper sloping surface and the lower sloping surface. The upper part of the roof, here this is upper part of the roof, is formed by the medial border of the superior cerebral peduncle. You can see this is a superior cerebral peduncle, and connected with the thin sheet of the white matter, that is called the superior medullary velum. Here you can see this is the superior medullary velum. The lower part, here you can see this lower part is formed by the inferior medullary velum, which is consist of the thin sheet of the non-nervous tissue formed by the ventricular ependyma and posteriorly covered by the pia mater. The lower part of the roof is pierced by the in the midline by the large aperture, that is called the foramen magendi, through which the cavity of the fourth ventricle communicates with the subarachnoid space, called as the of the cerebromedullary cisterna over here. You see. So this is the upper part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. Here you can see this is the lower part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. Now what are the tela cordia? Tela cordia is a double layer fold of the pia mater between the inferior vermis of the cerebellum and the lower part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So this is the tela cordia. Now the choroid plexus. What are the choroid plexus? The capillary plexus of the blood vessel between the two layers of the tela cordia to form the rich vascular fringe that project through the lower part of the roof of the fourth ventricle to form the choroid flexes. So these are the choroid flexes we can appreciate over here. These are the choroid flexes. It derives from the branch of the posterior inferior cerebral artery. Is derived from the posterior inferior cerebral artery. The flexes project into the cavity through the lower part of the roof. The entire flexes, here you can see this entire flexes is a T shape. Where the vertical limb, here you can see this is a vertical limb that double with the foramen majenti intervenes between the two limbs. Here you can see the foramen majenti. The horizontal limb, here you can see this is a horizontal limb of the flexes on the either side extend into the lateral laces. Here you can see the lateral laces and produced through the lateral aperture. You can see this is the lateral aperture that is called the foramen lusca into the subarachnoid space. So this is we can appreciate over here. These are so this is the roof of the fourth ventricle. We can appreciate into the specimen the roof of the fourth ventricle.
We can see the roof of the fourth ventricle onto the this specimen. Here you can see this is the roof and also called as the posterior wall. The roof, it is a tent shape. The apex is project posteriorly. Here you can see the apex is project posteriorly into the core of the bite of the cerebellum. Here it has the upper sloping surface and the lower sloping surface. Here you can see this is a lower sloping surface. Now the upper part of the roof, it is formed by the medial border of the superior cerebral peduncle connected with the thin sheet. Here you can see the thin sheet. We can see this is the thin sheet of the bite matter that is called as the superior medullary velum. Here you can see. Now the inferior also called the lower part of the roof is formed by the inferior medullary velum. Here you can see this is the inferior medullary velum. It consists of the inferior medullary velum is consist of the thin sheet of the non-nervous tissue. It formed by the ependyma and it posteriorly by the covering of the pia mater. Here the lower part of the roof, it pierced by the midline by the large aperture. Here you can see the large aperture that is called as the foramen majenti, through which the foramen majenti, the cavity of the fourth ventricle is communicate with the cerebellomedullary cisterna. Here you can see the foramen majenti. So this is the roof of the fourth ventricle. Here
now we can see the floor and the boundary of the fourth ventricle in this picture. We can firstly we can see the boundary of the fourth ventricle. So these are the floor of the fourth ventricle. So the diamond shape. So this is the supralateral boundary. Here you can see this is the supralateral boundary which is formed by the superior cerebral peduncle on the east side. Here you can appreciate over here. This is the supralateral boundary. Now the infralateral boundary, it is formed by the inferior cerebral peduncle on the east side, and inferiorly it is supplemented by the gracile and the cunate tubercle over here. So these are the boundary of the fourth ventricle. Now the floor, you can see the floor of the fourth ventricle is a diamond shape, also called the rhomboid fossa. The upper part of the floor is formed by the posterior surface of the pons, and the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle formed by the posterior surface and the upper open part of the medulla oblongata. Now we can appreciate over here the transversely running fiber. You can see over here. transversely running fiber we can see over here. These are steria medullaris. We can appreciate over here. These are derived from the arcuate nuclei. It runs laterally over to the medial eminence and into the inferior cerebral peduncle and to the cerebellum on the east side. Now the floor. This floor is divided into the two symmetrical halves by the median sulcus. Here you can appreciate over here. This is the median sulcus. You can appreciate over here. This one is the medial sulcus. The east side of the medial sulcus, here you can see the longitudinal elevation is called as the medial eminence. Here, on laterally is medial eminence is bounded by, we can appreciate over here, laterally bounded by the another sulcus that is called the sulcus limitans. Over here, this is the sulcus limitans. This sulcus limitant, the each half of the floor divide into the two area. The sulcus limitans is the each half of the floor divide into two area. Medial area that is called the medial eminence and the lateral area that is called the vestibular area. We can appreciate over here. This is the medial eminence. This is the vestibular area. Beneath to the vestibular area lie the vestibular nuclei over here. Now this the medial eminence, here the rounded elevation that is called the facial colliculus, which are produced by the, we can see appreciate over here on the east side. The fasciculus is produced by the fiber arise from the motor nucleus of the facial nerve and hook around to the abducent nuclei. So this is the facial colliculus. Now the sulcus limitant, the upper end of the sulcus limitant, we can see over here. This is the upper end of the sulcus limitant depression over here. This is the superior fovea. We can see appreciate over here. This is called as the superior fovea. Above to the superior fovea, the sulcus limitant flatten out and present a bluish gray color area here on the east side. You can appreciate over here. Bluish color area, that is where locus ceruleus. The color imparted by underlying the group of nerve cell and contain the melanin pigment which constitute the substantia ferruginea. The inferiorly, here the sulcus limited inferiorly, you can see this is inferiorly. The inferior end of the sulcus limited is another depression, that is the inferior fovea. So you can see the inferior fovea. From the inferior fovea, the sulcus limitant descend obliquely toward the median sulcus. So you can see the median sulcus. So these sulcus divide the medial eminence in the medullary part of the floor into the two triangle. So you can see this is the hypoglossal triangle above to the sulcus limitans, and below you can see this is the vagal triangle. Beneath the hypoglossal triangle that lie the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve and to the nucleus of the intercalatus. Now we can see the vagal triangle. These are the vagal triangle. Over beneath to the vagal triangle lie the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. The vagal triangle is crossed by the narrow transect ridge. Here you can see the narrow transect ridge. Can you also appreciate over here? So this is the narrow transect ridge, the funiculus separations. You can see the funiculus separations. Below to the funiculus separations, the area between the funiculus separations and the dorsal tubercle. This area is called as the area of postrema. This area consists of the highly vascular neuroglyal tissue. this area. You can see appreciate over here into this side. You can appreciate over here. So this is a hypoglossal triangle, this is a vagal triangle, and this is the area of posterior. Now inferior lateral margin of the floor of fourth ventricle is marked by the narrow white ridge. You can see this is a narrow white ridge. It is called as the tinea, and the two tinea meet at the inferior angle of the ventricle here to form the small fold called as the obex. This obex is formed the inferior angle of the roof of fourth ventricle. So this is about the floor and the boundary, and we can also appreciate these features into the specimen of floor of the fourth ventricle.
Now move to the floor and the boundary. So this is the floor of the fourth ventricle, also called the ventral wall, and the boundary and the lateral boundary. Now you can see the another specimen. So this is the another specimen. After removing the posterior aspect of the cerebellum, so we remove remove the cerebellum. So this is the medulla, this is the pons, and this is the midbrain, and this is the dorsal surface, also called the posterior surface. Now to the ventral surface of this is the ventral surface of the medulla, this is the pons, and this is the midbrain. Now move to the dorsal surface. Now you can see this is the diamond shape. This diamond shape into posterior surface of the pons and the upper part of the medulla oblongata. This is the diamond shape. It's called as the floor of the fourth ventricle. It also called as the rhomboidus fossa. Here, the upper part, this upper part of the upper triangular part of the fossa is formed by the posterior surface of the pons, and the lower part is formed by the posterior surface of the upper open part of the medulla oblongata over here. Now move to the boundary. Now the boundary, the superolateral boundary. Here you can see this is the superolateral boundary on the east side. This is bounded by the superior cerebral peduncle. Here you can see this is the superior cerebral peduncle, and inferior laterally it is bounded by inferior cerebral peduncle. Here you can see this is the inferior cerebral peduncle, and supplemented by the east side is the inferior cerebral peduncle, and supplemented by the gracile and the pinnate tubercle over here. That is formed the inferior lateral boundary, and the superior cerebral peduncle on the east side form the superolateral boundary. You can appreciate over here, this is the thick at the middle cerebral peduncle over here. Now move to the floor of the fourth ventricle. The floor of the fourth ventricle, you can see over here is the medial sulcus. This one the medial sulcus you can appreciate over here, which are divide the floor of the ventricle in the two symmetrical half. The two symmetrical half. On the each side of the medial sulcus, the longitudinal elevation, that is called the medial eminence. Over here, this is the medial eminence. On the lateral, it bounded by the medial eminence, the another sulcus, that is this. You can appreciate over here. This is another sulcus, that is the sulcus limitans over here, which are divide the each half of the floor into the two area by the lateral and the medial area. The medial area, that is called the medial eminence. Here you can see the medial eminence, and the lateral area, that is called is the vestibular area. Underneath the vestibular area lie the vestibular nuclei. And over here you can see the medial eminence, the small oval swelling, that is called the facial fasciculus. Facial colliculus. The facial colliculus, it is swelling is produced by the fiber arise from the motor nucleus of the facial motor nuclei of the facial nerve and a hook around to the abducent nuclei. So this is the facial colliculus. Now the sulcus limitans. So this is the sulcus limitant. The upper end of the sulcus limitant is the small depressed area that is called as the superior fovea. Above the superior fovea, the sulcus limitans is flattened out and present a bluish grey color. Over here, the bluish grey color called as the locus ceruleus, and the color is impacted by the underlying group of the nerve cell contain the melanin pigment and which constitute the substantia ferruginea over here, the bluish grey color area. Now the transversely running fiber, you can appreciate over here the transversely running fiber, the delicate transversely running fiber, you can appreciate over here, that is called the hysteria medullaris. This is the hysteria medullaris, which are derived from the arcuate nuclei, which emerge from the median sulcus and pass laterally over the medial eminence and to the vestibular area, entered into the inferior cerebral peduncle over here and reached into the cerebellum over here. The inferior to the hysteria medullaris, the floor of the fourth ventricle present the following feature. So firstly, now the lower end of the sulcus limitans. The lower end of the sulcus limitans is the small depression that is called the inferior fovea. The inferior fovea, the sulcus limitans, from the inferior fovea, the sulcus limitans it descend obliquely toward the median sulcus over here. And this sulcus is divide the medial eminence into the medullary part of the floor into two triangles. So above is the hypoglossal triangle. This is the between the median sulcus and the sulcus limitans. This is the hypoglossal triangle, and underneath the hypoglossal triangle lie the hypoglossal nuclei and nucleus of the intercollectus, and just another above to another below is the this is the another triangle is the vagal triangle. Below will lie the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve over here. This vagal triangle, so this is the lower part is the vagal triangle. This vagal triangle is crossed by the narrow transverse ridge. You can appreciate over here transverse bridge, the funiculus separations. You can see the funiculus separations, the small area between the funiculus separations and the gracile tubercle. This one the tubercle of gracile tubercle. This area is called the area postrema. So this area is called as the area of postrema. This area is consist of the highly vascular neuroglial tissue. This area is the neuroglial tissue. The inferior margin. So the inferior margin of the floor of the fourth ventricle marked by narrow white ridge that is called the tinea. These two tinea meet at the inferior angle over here. Inferior angle of the fourth ventricle to form the small fold that is called the obex. Here, obex. The obex is form the roof of the inferior angle of the fourth ventricle. This is the tinea. communication of the fourth ventricle. There are the 5 openings in the fourth ventricle. The one is the central aperture in the lower part of the roof, here the foramen majendi, and the 2 lateral opening we cannot appreciate over here. The lateral opening that is called the roof, that is called the foramen lusca, and the one is the cavity, the inferiorly is continuing the central canal this of the spinal cord, and superiorly is the cerebral aqueduct. Here you can see superiorly the cerebral aqueduct and communicate with the third ventricle over here. Out of these 5 openings, the CSF can be passed from the cavity of the fourth ventricle into the subarachnoid space only through the 3 openings in the roof, while the foramen majendi and the 2 lateral opening that is called the foramen lusca. So these are the opening and the communication of the fourth ventricle. This is all about the fourth ventricle.